In 2002, Burbank, California, had a serious mold problem. But the public and the scientific community were generally ignorant about the concept of indoor mold. I had rented a quaint house on Olive Avenue in Burbank to take care of my young boys as a single father. Unfortunately, the wealthy landlord had been painting over mold over the years, and the previous tenant was actually made very, very ill by the mold and fled. When I arrived, it seemed like the perfect opportunity until my family started to get deathly ill. In the end, we would lose over $300,000, and to this day, 2019, we still haven't recovered. But recently, we lived again in Burbank to give it another try. It turned out that the city was still just as moldy as it was in 2002, based on our observations. And when we discovered indoor problems in our facilities, both work and home, Burbank was equally ignorant and dismissive about the problem. Back in 2002, Burbank hired officers to chase my children around at 4 a.m. with flashlights to determine where we were living when we escaped the toxic mold house, because they said we had to stay in the house or my children would be expelled. Needless to say, this many years later, I find it disturbing that the situation in Burbank continues to be as ignorant as it ever was. That's why I'm a huge proponent of the concept that all landlords in the U.S., especially in California, should have to have licenses or be run by a licensed and accredited agency. No more should landlords be allowed to be ignorant about mold, hire ignorant contractors, and do the bare minimum while still allowing people to get sick and die. We need regulation. If there's any Congress people who would like to discuss this with me, I'm ready. So take a listen to this radio special back in 2002 with top experts about the subject of mold.
Mold doesn't exist or it doesn't have any effect on people. There's just too many people who have suffered endlessly from mold.
I'm a type A personality. Prior to this happening to me, I was 13 years into my career. Basically, the life that I had before is over.
I feel that the mold is highly toxic, and what caused me to have cancer, what I thought was my dream house turned into my nightmare.
Actually, my husband died, so I contacted every public official I could find. They weren't telling me that there is, basically there is no such thing as toxic mold. You can't be, none of this could have happened, because of toxic mold, and the fact that my husband's immune system was very badly depressed. But it didn't have anything to do with toxic mold. It had to do with the fact that he was allergic to milkweed or something. I don't know. Talk to somebody who's lost a kid and tell them that mold has no effect on them.
The people that are not aware of it or won't recognize it are the ones that are putting us in serious harm.
And all I say is you're hiding your head in the sand.
You feel sort of like you're a crazy person because so many people look at the effects of mold as only an allergic reaction. So I asked them if they're allergic to fire. Well, of course they say, no, I'm not. But then I asked them, well, then would you walk into a burning building?
Well, I don't know why I have this obligation to educate people, but I've distributed a lot of material, and there's websites, and if they still want to be stupid after that, I just let them be stupid. Our statements were submitted before the Senate to get the bill passed. I think the hardest part of all of this for us has been waiting for the legal aspects to iron out.
Told the owner of the house, the homeowners association, and us that nobody could live in the house until it was remediated. But then they refused to put it in writing because they didn't actually have the authority to do that.
I get phone calls from people who are panicking about mold.
I bring up the harmful effects and suggest that others search the internet, which I did, Katie.
But the environmental department in the health department had written to us telling us that this was a serious problem.
I'm going to have nightmares about this long after all the legal aspects of it is done. People are starting to treat me and my family differently.
they believe us now. I'm trying to get on with my life, and now having lost Mike too, I have to do it alone.
That was Sharon and Christy from Texas, Bonnie from New York, Pamela, Kathy, Sally, and Laura from California. I'm Katie Chen.
And I'm Richard Arsenault.
Tonight, an unprecedented live panel discussion on toxic mold because of your overwhelmingly positive response to the toxic mold investigative piece that ran 3 times on KPFK. Tonight, we're going to attempt to answer all of your questions with a panel of experts on this topic. We have Senator Deborah Ortiz, who joins us from her home in Sacramento this evening.
Dr. Gary Ordog, a medical toxicologist from Santa Clarita.
Bill Cook, Vice President of Public Adjuster Association of Florida, to answer your insurance questions.
Dr. Chuck Gilbert, an epidemiologist and testing specialist, joining us from New York.
Texas Attorney Edward Poole.
Ken Coffey, a remediation specialist in New York, to talk about solutions on how to get rid of toxic mold.
And my co-host, Richard Arsenault. Richard is a USC cinema alumnus and moves between motion picture, network television, and educational media. He has produced 500 educational titles, with his most recent series called Real Life Teens, covering important teen issues ranging from surviving terrorism and public hysteria to eating disorders. He was interviewed by KPFK about a year ago with his fiancée Eva regarding their documentary Behind Enemy Lines, the DNC 2K protests. And he's also fighting his own battle with toxic mold. He's done extensive amounts of research to help his family and himself get better. And although he says he's not an expert, with the amount of work he's done, I believe he is. Now, lots of you have questions for our panelists, so to get to all of your calls and not to duplicate any of the questions, we'd like you to call in throughout the show, and our producer, Andrew Evans, will take your name, where you're calling from, whom you'd like to answer your question, and what your question is. And if we haven't answered the questions during the show, we'll do it at the end. So if you have a question, please call us at 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK.
We're going to start tonight by finding out exactly what toxic mold is. Now, there's 100,000 species of mold out there. They're not all toxic. So Dr. Ordog and Dr. Chuck Gilbert will try to break through this most important question. Dr. Ordog, what is toxic mold?
That's mold that is producing toxins or poisons that generally affect people inside buildings. So there would be a history of water intrusion into the building usually, and that would involve either a flood or a pipe rupturing or the roof leaking or some obvious water intrusion that makes the materials in the building wet. And then after several days of the building materials being wet, then mold can start to grow. So there may either be a history of water intrusion, or the mold may actually be visible, as stains on the walls, stains on the ceiling, stains on the carpeting, for example. Or you may be able to smell the mold, as a musty or mildewy smell, which is a good sign that there's mold growing or has been mold growing inside the building. Most people are toxic for molds. It happens in the building, so usually the home or the work site's the most common places that this occurs. So there has to be water added to the building. There has to be water intrusion. Now, sometimes the water intrusion may be a small, pipe leak inside a wall, so it may not always be visible. But if proper testing is done, then the mold can be found inside the walls. But if there is like a small pipe leak inside a wall, then you may have a musty smell, in the home, especially if the building's sealed up, and you open it up, you go in from a vacation, for example, if you smell that musty, moldy smell, then it indicates there's a problem. So people can understand this better. They can think of this as analogous to anthrax in some ways, because although anthrax is a bacterium, it produces a spore, just like these molds that we're talking about, and how it does its injury is through toxins, just like we're talking about with these molds. So, what you're reading about anthrax is somewhat analogous to what we're doing with the molds.
So when we're speaking of toxic mold, we're not talking about the actual spores necessarily. We're talking about something else entirely. Is that true?
Yes, the the toxins can be on the spores, so inhaling or touching the spores may contain the toxin, but they can also be free or actually enclosed within the mold, or can float around in the air or on dust particles or other objects that you touch or inhale.
Why is toxic mold dangerous? I've been told it's dangerous to all vertebrate life forms. What does that mean exactly?
Well, again, some of these chemicals cause toxicity or poisoning in the body by, for example, interfering with enzyme systems that allow your cells to metabolize properly. The ones from stachybotrys called trichothecenes inhibit protein synthesis so that your body can't produce protein properly. And all of the enzyme systems in your body are also produced from proteins.
Is there a reason that these molds produce these mycotoxins? Is there some benefit in nature to these?
Yes, they basically inhibit the growth of other organisms that may be threatening to them, such as bacteria and anything in the environment that may encroach upon its space. The mold produces toxins to keep those other bacteria, other organisms, and even other molds out of the area.
Dr. Gilbert, are you with us tonight?
Yes, I am.
How is toxic mold different than common molds? For instance, if I go and eat a mushroom, I'm eating fungus, or if I bake bread, I'm using yeast. Why is it that toxic mold is dangerous, but these other molds are actually edible?
It's mainly because of the different substances that they produce that are toxins. Fungi have a number of associates with them. They have spores, they have fragments of parts and hyphae, and they produce these metabolites. And a number of these different toxins that they produce, we get a number of different types of diseases from them. We can actually get an allergic response, an infection, or toxicoses from these things. And these particular ones, and some of the ones of concern that we have in an indoor environment, would include different species of penicillium, aspergillus, chaetomonium. Stachybotrys is fairly famous these days. But in addition, there's also fusarium, trichoderma, Minalia, and there's a whole host of them. And these, some of them produce some things that we may have heard of in the past. Aflatoxin B1, I think, may be famous to some people who watch the literature because it's found in peanuts, if you will, and the song about the peanuts is may be familiar to some folks, and that aflatoxin is associated with carcinogenesis of the liver, and there's also some other toxins, if you will, ochratoxin. That particular one is associated with renal carcinogenesis. So these organisms, as Dr. Ordog pointed out, for some reason in their evolutionary life have done a couple of different things. One, they've made extensive efforts at learning how to break down things. The other thing that they've done is learn how to set up defensive barriers and protective areas so they can protect their space.
Dr. Ordog, when you have more than one of these molds right next to each other, what does that do? Does that create a bit of a cocktail effect in the victims of poison, as it were?
Yes, we often see more than one mold growing in a building, for example, producing obviously many mycotoxins or the poisons that are produced with a myriad of effects from this combination. And it's felt that the combination of these mycotoxins or poisons is not only additive upon each other, but often the effects are multiplied together. So the effects are even worse than just having one mold there.
You're listening to KPFK 90.7 FM.
Physically, I just feel completely broken. I have been to 25 doctors.
I've had lung cancer, staph infection in my eyes, aspergillus sinusitis.
Chest pain and breathing problems, some days not being able to get out of bed, constant fatigue all the time.
Itchy and rashy skin conditions.
Migraines so bad that I have my nerve endings burned off every 6 months.
Mold can be very harmful, and don't underestimate the serious effects it has.
I feel like my life has been violated because of it, because my dreams now turned into nightmares. and my enjoyment for life now became my battle for life.
You become angry at and untrusting of other people who don't understand, who won't listen. It's truly an environmental issue, not just a medical problem.
I'm just hoping that someday science will be there and find out what's going on.
Again, you're listening to KPFK 90.7 FM. We're talking toxic mold tonight, and we're answering your questions. So if you have one for our panel of experts, call us at 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK. Senator Deborah Ortiz joins us from her home in Sacramento. She authored the Toxic Mold Protection Act, which became effective in January of this year. Thanks for joining us, Senator Ortiz.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Senator, how does the Toxic Mold Protection Act help change previous laws?
Well, what we're hoping to do is the legislation will require the State Department of Health Services to adopt permissible standards and limits for mold. If they're unable, because there is certainly some controversy as to what permissible levels may or may not be, then we're requiring the department to then develop guidelines to at least identify certain molds, to look for criteria that might trigger some determination that there's a presence of mold or molds and that would make it unsafe. There are also significant residential and commercial landlords, also sellers of property, either residential or commercial, will now have to do very express disclosures whether they have any reason to believe that mold is present or that there was a prior existence of it, either in the tenant situation or the sale situation. Also calling for education standards. The Department of Consumer Affairs would have to examine and determine those standards. Also to certify the persons, the professionals whose job it is either to say that mold is indeed present or after going in and doing extensive and expensive work to determine whether or not it's safe to re-enter. And then finally, it expressly says that local governments have a responsibility to have their either housing inspectors or their building inspectors. It authorizes those individuals to respond to complaints about mold and to enforce, once the standards are adopted by the Department of Health Services, whatever those standards of mold exposure may be.
Edward Poole is also joining us. He's an attorney in Texas. Mr. Poole, why do people need protection from toxic mold?
Well, the fact simply is that people are being injured out there. For years, it seems that insurance companies and landlords both have felt that they can act with impunity and be insulated from those consequences. Some insurers have delayed and refused to pay property claims, really with little or no justification, or they'll wrongfully offer less than a claim is known to be worth to people that are desperate for cash. They do this realizing that a vast majority of people will never complain when they feel wronged by their insurance company or by their landlords. And the people need to know about the potential effects of this mold so that they can properly protect themselves.
Now, Senator Ortiz, how did you come about to author the Toxic Mold Protection Act?
Well, I had a number of instances in lots of high-density multifamily apartments in my district in which families who certainly didn't have a lot of wealth would be very sick and have to move out after numerous attempts by apartment managers or owners to try to cover up or paint over mold, and very, very pervasive illnesses with families that would have to get rid of every piece of property they own, from sofas to children's clothing and toys, as well as a number of homeowners who, actually were getting very sick, neurological. I mean, I think the doctors can give a little more detail of the significant respiratory, neurological, long-term cognitive kinds of problems that come from serious exposure. But homeowners, people who the only thing they owned was their home, and in fact found little to no relief from their insurance companies and had to move out. In one case, a family had to burn down their home. The final constituent that came to me was a business person. She joined me along with the Child Abuse Prevention Council, a local union, and this woman who owned a business, the Job Journal, who all had been in this tenant situation and they were very sick, and they were getting little to no relief from their landlord.
Ken Coffey is a remediation specialist. He's joining us from New York, along with Drs. Gary Ordog and Chuck Gilbert. Dr. Gilbert, toxic mold is a unique anomaly in the world of mold, and what conditions arise that allow this toxic species of mold to grow? Dr. Gilbert, are you with us? Is Dr. Ordog available?
Yes.
Dr. Ordog, could you answer that question?
Yes. Speaking of buildings, it requires a water source, so there has to be water intrusion, such as from a leaking roof, a flood, toilet backup, water pipe leak. So there needs to be a water source. The mold needs food to grow on, which is often in the case of toxic mold provided by the cellulose of the building structure. So the wall board, particle boards, the wood in the home and building, for example, acts as a food source. And then the mold can grow and produce its toxins. So basically, the first thing it needs is a water source.
So if there's no water from the roof, from the windowsills, from plumbing breaks, we don't have a toxic mold condition. Is that pretty accurate?
That's pretty accurate, yes.
So those people that are listening right now, chewing on their fingernails, hysterically nervous about the implications of this, if they're living in an environment that has been well maintained and they're showing no symptoms and their building has a very good maintenance record, would they be less likely to be victims of this than the average person who knows they have the symptoms? Is that pretty accurate? Trying to reduce public hysteria on a very emotional issue. Oh, Dr. Ordog has just been cut off. And is Mr. Ken Coffey on the line?
Yes.
Ken, what would you say to the modern building materials and practices? Is this the reason that toxic mold has become a bit of an issue right now?
Well, there are certain issues as far as operation design and maintenance, and also the pattern of recycling certain types of building materials, and not understanding whether or not we're able to, in the recycling process, sterilize them appropriately so that these spores that may be sitting dormant could potentially amplify at a much more rapid rate once you have either high humidity or moisture intrusion.
What sort of building supplies are you speaking of that have, do they have the spores already in them?
Well, certain building materials, if you're recycling, if we were doing a remediation and we're tearing out contaminated wallboard, in many instances it goes to a recycling center where it's ground up and reused. Now, there are certain processes that they go through to sanitize them, but is it sporicidal? Is it disinfecting? Do we know enough about it? And from a biosurfaces standpoint, what are we doing to prevent reamplification with relatively minor water events in buildings?
So you're saying that this issue is touching upon a lot of different industries, not just the health industry, not just the insurance industry. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Dr. Ordog, when you see a patient, when do you suspect that they are a legitimate toxic mold patient, not someone that just has pre-existing conditions?
By going through their history and physical and relating it to a time, usually of water intrusion and mold growth that wasn't properly remediated or quickly remediated. For example, a flood that wasn't dried up within 3 days, for example, and then basing their signs and symptoms on what we know about toxic mold signs and symptoms. And then we also can do testing both on the environmental testing as well as testing on the patient to confirm it.
Dr. Ordog, I know the list goes on, but just briefly, what are the general symptoms that are most often complained by patients?
Part of the problem with this is that there is no specific symptom that really points out, yes, that's toxic mold causing that. So usually there's a myriad of symptoms that we put together and can't be explained from any other source. So anything from headaches to memory loss to numbness to weakness to dizziness, shortness of breath, sinus infections, sinus congestion, recurrent infections, cough, wheezing, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle aches and pains, symptoms of what looks like maybe fibromyalgia, skin infections, toenails being discolored, fungal skin infections, rashes, itchiness, recurrent ear infections, other recurrent infections, and I could go on. But anyway, nothing really specific that a doctor would see, yes, that symptom, is a mold problem. That's part of the problem with this disease.
Except one more question on the medical front, which is, of course, an incredibly deep area. Many of the toxic mold patients that I've talked to across America have almost no immune systems left. In other words, opportunistic infections come in, and then, some of them go beyond that. Why does it destroy your immune system if you've been truly exposed?
Many of the mycotoxins are immune suppressive. That is, they are toxic to the immune system, including the white blood cells of the body and the production of antibodies, for example, and other factors that help fight off infection and cancer. And these are actually produced by the molds and do cause immune suppression.
We use various procedures to basically detoxify the patient. And one of them involves a series of supplements that help the liver metabolize the fat-soluble mycotoxin, turning them into water-soluble so that it can be excreted from the body. We've also found that what we call heat depuration works. That's sweating with heat, like a sauna or jacuzzi or a hot tub, etc. There's fat that comes out in the sweat that actually contains some of the mycotoxins, so that has been found to help. There's certain things we can do to improve the immune system because one of the big factors is immune suppression from these poisons from the mold. So we help do things to help the immune system treat the infections that are associated with this. And often they need antifungal agents. They're sort of like antibiotics that are used to kill the mold that's growing in the body. People can become worse for several reasons. One is being re-exposed, because once you become sick from this, if you're re-exposed, it takes very little to make you worse. Also, if there's a certain point where some of the damage becomes permanent, and then it's really hard to get a recovery from that. Especially if you've had several years of exposure causing neurological damage, it's difficult for the brain to recover once it's been permanently injured. So then there's also a point where cells start dying in the body from the mold toxins, and you can develop antibodies to certain components of those cells, looking like an autoimmune disease. Some people can become extremely sensitive to both these chemicals and then further chemicals, and they can develop multiple chemical sensitivities, which will make them worse. So they become very sensitive to not only mold, but to other chemicals as well. Some people, their immune systems become so damaged that, they get recurrent infections, and it's a real battle to improve their immune system. Sometimes we have to replace their immune systems artificially.
KPFK 90.7 FM. Joining us tonight is Senator Deborah Ortiz, Dr. Gary Ordog, Bill Cook, who's also Vice President of Public Adjuster Association of Florida. And Senator Ortiz, how many citizens have expressed concerns to you about toxic mold?
Well, I had a number of constituents from my own district that certainly contacted me over a number of months. And then once the bill was introduced, we began to get inquiries from across the state, actually across the nation, and I'd say at least hundreds of either persons are affected by this or interest groups affected by it. It was amazing to see how consistent it was across the country that it has become a huge problem and a very, very difficult policy issue to address.
Now, I have a question from a listener, and this has to do with public schools, and he's asking if how does one get a public school that's contaminated with toxic mold investigated and possibly closed down when the school district is denying it and hiding the contamination problem?
Well, as we were moving through the legislature, the question was raised whether public buildings were affected, and it was our intent to, in fact, cover them. and I don't have the specific language of the bill in front of me at the moment, but I would recommend that he first certainly go appeal to his the superintendent of the school district, the school board, if necessary, ask for authorization to have the site tested. But I think trying to work cooperatively probably is the best thing. And then if he's unable to get them to voluntarily do so, then certainly if there's some indicia, there's enough data to suggest that children are having a pattern of illnesses in employees, then I think a jurisdiction could either rest with the local building inspectors of the city or county or the code enforcement officers, and you should then appeal to the city council, the board of supervisors to step in.
I'd like to say that cooperation is the key here. Hysteria is not the answer to this. If you do have concerns like this, go to your school, talk to people, become part of the solution. Don't just point fingers all the time. Parents out there know this is the most effective way to deal with schools or any other public agency. They already have a lot of things to worry about. They don't want one more thing to be hysterical about. So if there really is a problem, investigate it. There's scientific solutions. This is not rocket science here.
And on that note, Dr. Orduck, how common is toxic mold?
I believe it's fairly common. I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here. Some estimates done by the government show that there's probably at least 5% of homes and buildings do have some degree of toxic mold in them at the present time. To answer that last question, we've investigated and studied and treated teachers and students from approximately 50 schools in our office, and we've had good luck with an EPA program called Tools for Schools, and that gives the parents some power to order tests and do investigations through the schools if they're concerned. And the EPA.gov is a website where they can look up this information.
Mr. Cook, is this an increasing problem or an old problem?
It's a problem that's been around for many, many years, but the companies are just beginning to recognize it as a problem that they're responsible for. In the past, most of the time, they would simply explain to the insured that mold was not covered, and the insured would accept that and move on. But now they find that due to many payments that they've had to pay for mold, that they have to give it full consideration now.
Yeah, we'll talk about insurance a little later in the show, but do new building techniques and mixing old with new materials add to the problem?
One of the problems that they have is that the buildings aren't allowed to breathe and get rid of the excess moisture that may be accumulating in a normal building as they did in the past.
And does this problem end up generating sort of a bellows effect in the walls? I'm saying this obviously because I know the answer, but what does that actually mean? Why wouldn't the old farmhouse at the top of the hill have toxic mold in it necessarily?
Those houses were built with a different standard and using different materials that were used in those days that didn't contain some of the recycled products that are in the sheetrock material or the drywall materials that are in there today. Plus, the old farmhouse leaked a lot of air. Now they wrap a house so tightly that the house can't breathe, and any moisture that gets inside of the house, instead of either flowing on through or running out the bottom, will stay in the walls and in the interstitial space in the cavities and just create an atmosphere of their own. And they are some days raining, some day fog, some day raining, and moving from the hot side to the cool side of the walls.
So you don't necessarily have to see toxic mold to have it?
No, many times you won't see it. It'll be hidden because it's in a confined space in its atmosphere where it's ideal for it to grow.
This obviously leads to the questions of how do we test for and how do we deal with it. Do you think Mr. Cook, can a listener do preliminary testing on him or herself?
They can save a lot of money if they can establish whether or not they do have a problem with the mold by using some simple procedures to test for it. They can go to sites like the moldtesting.lab and they can find out how to process a cellophane tape lift to establish if they do have a problem, and that may allow them to go further with some of the more expensive testing.
Moldtestinglab.com provides a test that is a legitimate test, and I think one of the concerns that we have is that there's a lot of people getting involved in this. They see the money, and we have to make sure that the tests we do are legitimate. Is that something you're afraid of a little bit?
Well, I have a concern that there are a lot of charlatans that have just entered this business. There's a lot of money to be made in the mold because it is an expensive and extensive process to protect the people from the mold growing in the home. But to do a proper test, you should have it certified by a lab. And rather, some of these home testing kits will not make the determination of whether you do or do not have a problem. They will just sample what's going on at that particular instant.
Senator Ortiz, if someone actually did a test on their own and they went to their landlord with it, is there anything in the Toxic Mold Protection Act regarding that?
Well, let me just kind of explain where we are with the implementation of California's new law. The bill was passed, was effective January 1 of 2002, but it also gave sort of a grace period for the State Department of Health Services to gather together the scientists, the doctors, the participants, all the stakeholders in the industry as well, to work together to establish the standards and or criteria for exposure, safe or unsafe. Those standards should be in the process of being developed now. We are, unfortunately, in a little bit of a dilemma in California right now because as a result of this year's budget situation, the Department of Health Services had to reduce their staffing by 15%. So early indications are that there will be even further delayed implementation. However, once those standards are developed, which they should be in the process of, there's 6 months after that adoption of those new standards, then a tenant would be then subject to a disclosure requirement. If the landlord failed to disclose that there had previously been mold, or they reasonably believed mold to be present at the time of the tenancy, and in fact that mold appears and was a result of a pre-existing condition before the tenant moved in, they would have a remedy against the landlord for failure to disclose or otherwise. That same failure to disclose would be available to someone who buys, for example, a commercial or residential building. So sort of a long way of saying it, those standards are not in place. We've got to get them in place. There will be 6 months from the time they're adopted in which the tenant, buyer, etc., employee would be able to use those.
You're listening to KPFK 90.7 FM.
The insurance company wouldn't have anything to do with it. They're probably wishing they had now. Since we've been here, the 2 years that I've been in this hotel, there have been at least 8 other people who've come in here because of mold. And every one of them seem to have the same problem, is the insurance companies are now taking it seriously, but only so that they can stall you for 6 and 8 months at a time. And by the time you realize that they're not going to do anything else, that they're not going to help you remediate the house, they're not going to help you do anything, it's too late to file a lawsuit.
You're listening again to KPFK 90.7 FM, and we're talking about toxic mold. And as you just heard, we're talking now about insurance. A lot of people have questions about this portion of our show on toxic mold. We're talking to Senator Deborah Ortiz, Dr. Gary Ordog, and Bill Cook, Vice President of Public Adjuster Association of Florida. Mr. Cook, let's start with you. How is insurance dealing with this matter?
Well, the first thing the insurance company does is pull the no trigger because it saves them money if they can avoid addressing the issues of the claim. But if they pin to the wall and finally have to admit that coverage is in place, then they may, again, do whatever they can to reduce it or delay payment as long as they can. They use economic leverage to force the insured to comply with how they want them to do on it. And sometimes how they bring in their experts is not always in the best interest or what the insured would want done if it were being handled properly.
Now, Senator Ortiz, why did insurance agencies lobby so hard against the Toxic Mold Protection Act, which you authored?
Well, I think some of it has been touched on, but let me just be a little more direct. Homeowners' policies in California are either silent on mold or, unfortunately, more recently, we have begun to see insurance companies seeking through a regulatory process through our Department of Insurance, basically exclusions, mold exclusions in ongoing policies. The cost to remediate mold for example, in a homeowner's policy could be in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. We have seen, I have heard from constituents that their efforts to seek recovery or assistance in the case of a homeowner policy have been denied up front, as the earlier speaker mentioned. And then if there's a very resourceful and educated and organized homeowner policyholder, who then pushes the issue, they may get a delay. They may get partial payment for some of the improvements, but I have yet to see through the homeowner's policy any of my cases of constituents get a full cost of the recovery. And more alarming is we are seeing these companies seeking and being granted approval by our Department of Insurance to expressly exclude mold coverage, which is a very, very troubling trend that I'm hoping to address through cooperating with our insurance commission, the chair of the Senate Insurance Committee. I'm seeking her assistance to have a joint hearing on the issue. But time may be running out. I understand Texas, state of Texas, there is no mold exclusion or mold coverage for homeowners policies in the state of Texas, is what we've been told, that they've all been granted exclusions throughout the state of Texas.
Mr. Ed Poole could probably talk a little bit about that once we get him on the line. But Dr. Ordog, what has been your experience with health insurance companies paying for the treatment of toxic mold?
Usually they cover the treatment without a problem, all the testing involved, except for the very expensive tests such as the brain imaging tests, the PET scans, and things that are required to prove or show mold toxicity of the brain. Some of those tests are very expensive and usually involves a little bit of a fight with the insurance companies to get them approved. But otherwise, the treatment is usually accepted. Some of the medications, again, are extremely expensive. The antifungal agent we use, usually Sporanox, is up to $800 a month just for the treatment. Some of the treatment for immune suppression, such as replacing antibodies to the patients, again, is extremely expensive. And although most of the time they'll pay for it, some of the time it's a fight with the insurance companies.
Have you seen a change since the beginning when you first started treating toxic mold patients with the health insurance companies as you do now?
I would say, if anything, it's gotten worse. More denials and more letters to the insurance companies and medical necessity letters trying to get the insurance companies to authorize treatments and testing.
Now, Mr. Cook, why do you think insurance companies are putting pressure on this issue?
Because they have such a high exposure for paying out money. If they fail to properly address the issues of the coverage, then they could be held liable for the in addition to the contractual responsibilities, to some tort liability for compensating somebody should they be injured by the mold, health-wise.
Senator Ortiz, are lobbyists putting pressure on setting the toxic mold levels by June? That's what we're hearing.
Well, I hope that we can find the money in the Department of Health Services. There was an interesting group of lobbyists from many different sides of the issue that worked with us on the legislation. It was very, very politically charged with insurance companies, the building industry, the apartment association, the chambers of commerce, and then, of course, the consumer advocates, the tenant advocates, the consumer attorneys. And we all kind of worked together to fashion what was, I think, a workable model. The very disappointing discovery most recently was throughout the legislative process, we were assured that the department would not need an appropriation from the legislature to implement the legislation. And there certainly was a lot of effort not to get the bill through the process by some who would oppose any regulatory scheme. However, we have most recently heard statements by the department that they cannot implement it because they need funding to do so. So this, I hope that the pressure is being placed on the department to, in fact, carry out what was their representation, that they would be able to do so without an appropriation. And we're all trying to make the department and the administration implement the intent and the statutory language of the bill.
I think many of the mold victims across America have expressed concerns that if California sets levels that are inappropriate or are in no way representative of what the experts out there know, that it could set back the entire nation, and their concern was dealing with special interest groups. Are we able to find out who are going to be setting these acceptable levels, and can the panelists here offer their help in establishing those levels?
Well, I would welcome participation by particularly the doctors, the scientists. As everybody who's a part of this panel discussion this evening knows, there are some who would suggest that this is an illusory problem. It's simply sensitivities. So the fact that there isn't consensus in the medical community and there isn't consensus in the scientific community is a challenge. The challenge that I was faced with is not to move anything forward. I am confident that, this is the Department of Health Services. They have the responsibility to protect public health in the state of California. There will be advocates that are part of that in the medical community, as well as the stakeholders. I mean, the Apartment Association, to their credit, was probably fairly cooperative with us and actually really preferred to see standards put in place that are scientifically supportable, because they, in fact, don't want the solution to be ongoing litigation. And as much as the building industry and the Chamber of Commerce don't like the cost of new standards or construction defect cases, they too realize that litigation should not be the ideal solution. So I'm happy to have, please contact my office. I have a website, Ortiz@Senate.gov, or I'm happy to give my Capitol office number if there are those who would like to work through my office with the department, and that number is area code 916-445-7807.
We're talking about toxic mold and the rare situations of what happens when you have it and how to deal with it. We're talking to Texas Attorney Edward Poole, Vice President of Public Adjuster Association of Florida, Bill Cook, and Dr. Chuck Gilbert, an epidemiologist and testing specialist, joining us tonight from New York. Mr. Cook, can a listener do preliminary testing, him or herself, such as the tests from moldtestinglab.com?
Many times the insured will relinquish control of his claim over to the insurance company and allow them to establish the protocols and the testing that's going to be done on their own, when in fact they should be establishing the problems with the mold by some disinterested party, not somebody that's working for the insurance company to do it. So yes, they should make every effort to establish on their own devices what the problems with the mold are.
Mr. Poole, what happens if the tests come back positive for toxic mold?
Well, if the initial test comes back positive, there's going to need to be a more thorough air quality analysis done, because this is going to dictate the scope of the remediation that's done. The only way to do that properly is for the insurance company and the remediation expert to know the full nature and extent of the contamination. So that's going to be the first step. If your listeners pay to have these tests done themselves, then they need to get the results of these tests to their insurance companies right away, so that the insurance companies can work with the listeners and try to move forward and put together an appropriate scope of remediation.
The resource that I turned to first was themoldsource.com, and I was blessed with the information they provided. Although in those days we had to go on our own, but nowadays there's a lot of legitimate people out there to solve the problem. And Dr. Gilbert, how do you know if the person you're hiring is a legitimate remediation or testing specialist?
That's very challenging to determine whether someone is a specialist or not, because there are no real criteria, there are no standards, there are no certifications available right now, and in fact the the public is a little bit at their own, on their own in this fashion. So you have to interview the people that you're talking to, and I guess the best way to do it would be to get 3 references in this regard. Talk to professionals that you've heard of, or research them through folks that you know, or even on the internet. The mold source is a good place to start. And then start interviewing the people and ask them about the techniques that they use to do the remediation.
Now, what if I see a bunch of stachy on the wall? Is this something that I should handle myself, or is this a dangerous proposition?
Do you mean to clean it up yourself?
Correct. Will this become a problem for me?
I would not recommend that people who do not know how to remediate the mold do it themselves for a number of different reasons. One, you don't have any idea of the extent of the problem. You may see some on the outside, but on the reverse side of the wallboard, there may be more significant concentrations of fungi than are apparent. The same would be true in ceilings and other hidden spaces and voids inside the building. So you really don't want to do it on that aspect. The other aspect is you just don't have the equipment. You need full respiratory protective equipment so you don't get exposed to these different toxin, fungal particles, spores, and the metabolites. The other stuff is you just don't have the tools. You will need a specialized vacuum cleaner called a HEPA filtered vacuum cleaner, and that filters out very, very small particles of that are flying around in the air. And then the other things, a lot of folks, I get calls virtually every day concerning people who want to use bleach to spray on the wall and get rid of the mold that's there. And it just doesn't work. One of the analogies that I liken it to with them is that if you go into your yard and you have a bunch of dandelions in the yard, you can cut the heads off the dandelions, but you have not killed that organism. The same is true with when you use mold on porous surfaces. You can kill the upper part of the vegetative organism, but below the surface, that organism still is thriving, and when conditions are right, it will bloom once again.
Now, Mr. Poole, we're not advocating lawsuits here, but when is a lawsuit the only remedy?
Generally speaking, that's when the insurance companies have engaged in unfair settlement practices. The insurance companies have entered into a contract with the homeowner, and the concept of good faith and fair dealing applies. When the homeowner calls the insurance company and reports a problem, they expect reasonably to have a properly trained adjuster come to their house and adjust the claim. Okay? The training is necessary for the adjuster to know what is happening, and an insurance company should never be allowed to hide behind lack of training or ignorance on the part of their adjusters. So it's improper adjusting tactics, it's delays that Senator Ortiz was talking about earlier. When these types of occurrences are involved, it's generally appropriate for the homeowner to go ahead and contact an attorney and seek some help.
And we're talking about toxic mold. We've covered what it is, how it's dangerous, why people need protection, how the new legislation authored by Senator Ortiz might protect, and solutions on getting rid of toxic mold. We've covered a lot of ground in this hour, but we have some questions we didn't get to, and we're going to take a quick break, and coming back, we will answer some of your questions.
The funniest thing that I would do, I would take my dolls and I'd pretend that they're a rock band and that they're moving to the music and playing to it. But of course, because the dolls were small, I had to make the music also high-pitched and, faster sounding so that it would go with the dolls. It was flamenco even sometimes that we would do this to. Really funny. Everything that became part of me musically and culturally, even the games that I would play when I was a child, and I've been able to bring it into my KPFK programming. I'm not playing it at 78 speed, but it's still from the same vision.
Yatrika Shah-Rais hosts the Wednesday edition of The Global Village here on 90.7 KPFK.
You're listening to KPFK 90.7 FM. We've been talking about toxic mold for this past hour, and we are now getting to some of your questions.
Dr. Ordog, Paul in the Bay Area wants to know why the Centers for Disease Control has taken a conservative stance on toxic mold as opposed to the other federal and state level organizations and not making the public more aware of this problem. Do you have any ideas? Dr. Ordog?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, that's a difficult question. I can't really answer, what they're thinking, but I think they probably wanted more in-depth studies done to prove the situation before they, actually acknowledge it in full, and that may have something to do with it.
Which is good science, except that there are tens of thousands of people being affected, and we have to find out the
Definitely.
Now, Senator Ortiz, this might be a question for you. Renee is listening online in Vermont, and she wants to know how you can get senators and politicians involved in the controversy of toxic mold, and I assume that she's talking about her in her area.
Well, I would suggest she call her representatives, try to make visits, bring documentation, tell the story, share, the trends nationally, and I think there's a threshold level of information and efforts, quite frankly, not all successful, to try to regulate a very difficult sort of issue, and make her case with her representative and have others join her and just bring good documentation.
Mr. Poole, Elvis from Simi Valley wants to know if his mother has a workman's compensation lawsuit because she might have gotten sick from toxic mold at work. What should she do, and is this a simple matter?
It's not going to be a simple matter. It needs to be determined what she was exposed to at work, and a lot of times with a workers' comp, you have a statute of limitations issue, which is much shorter than a homeowner's or, let's say, a tenant's issue. If she suspects that she has been exposed, she needs to contact someone as soon as possible to follow up on this and advise her of her legal rights.
Dr. Ordog, here's a question about toxic mold and mycotoxins. Karen from Laguna Niguel has toxic mold, and she lives in a condo unit and wants to know if the mold could spread to the other units, but maybe more importantly, once she has left the unit and her furniture has been cleaned for mold, can she reintroduce these pieces of furniture to the home?
The first part of the question, I assume they have common walls, so it is potentially possible that, at least the adjoining units may have a problem. If there's any continuity of the air conditioning and heating systems, there may be some spread of contamination that's possible. Water leakage or the cause of the mold, may have seeped into the other units, and that's commonly seen. So, yes, some of the other units may also be at risk. And as far as the furniture, it would depend on the case, but if it's a heavily contaminated unit with mold growth, throughout the unit, including on the furniture and that, usually we recommend that, especially if the person is ill, that they should probably get rid of the furniture.
And Dr. Ordog, I've gotten a fax here that's asking if there's a medical test that can determine the presence and or levels of mycotoxins in the human body.
Not currently, no. It's taken on the clinical situation, the signs and symptoms associated with the environmental reports. There are blood tests that help prove exposure to molds. Some of the immune tests also help with that, but there's no specific blood test at the present time that confirm the presence of mycotoxins within the body directly. Again, there's some antibody tests which confirm it indirectly, but nothing specific at the present time for mycotoxins.
Dr. Ordog, Denise in Chasters wants to know where she can get a low-cost medical evaluation for mold because you might be too pricey for her.
Good question.
There are more and more experts.
Ever call us, and we can work something out.
Okay, Denise, you heard that. Give him a call, and we can work something out. We've got about a minute left, and let's wrap things up a bit. Thank you for joining us, all the panelists, Dr. Ordog, Bill Cook, Dr. Gilbert, Edward Poole, Ken Coffey, Senator Ortiz, and thank you for joining us and for your questions, and big thanks to the moldsource.com for helping us get this group of expert panelists together, and thanks to our producer, Andrew Evans, and our engineer, Craig Gleaner. I'm Katie Chen.
This is Richard Arsenault. I want to say one last thing. This is a major health issue for those that are affected, but for the average person not being exposed to toxic mold, move on with your life. Those that have the symptoms, that have the environment that would create it, yes, look into it, get solutions, don't give up. And those that have to lose everything, our hearts are with you. But the bottom line is, do the right thing. Take care of yourself.
Good night.